The Business Simplicity Podcast, where leaders share their most successful strategies and the failures that inspired them, so business owners and managers can avoid the suffering and reap the benefits. With your host, Chris Parker.
Welcome to the Business Simplicity Podcast. This is Chris Parker, and I'm having a conversation with Michael Wenderoth. And I learned about Michael back in March this year on the podcast called Leading from the Front with Dr. Gary McGrath. And it was all about power. And I was really captivated by this whole thing. Michael will tell you about power. I'm going to ask him some questions about powerlessness as well. What does that mean? I think we're going to have a fun time. But I would really recommend to go back to Dr. Gary's episode from March, because this might actually be just like a part 2 of that, because I'm going to be asking him some questions that basically just came to mind when I was listening to that excellent episode. I've also have read and enjoyed, and we'll be asking him questions about his book, which was recently published, called Get Promoted: What You're Really Missing at Work That's Holding You Back. And this is fascinating. There's a model in there about power mapping as well, and I believe that's what we're going to dive into. But before we get into the meat of it, Michael, can you, in the most simple way possible, share with us what is it that you do? Who are you?
So, Chris, the question I would ask to your audience is, have you ever felt stalled at work? That despite all the great things you do and you do what you're told, you feel like your smarts and your hard work are being overlooked or underappreciated. And at the same time, are you seeing kind of what you believe to be less competent people getting promoted ahead of you or getting more things done? Well, I'm an executive coach that helps these great people get ahead by helping them ethically leverage power and politics to break through and ascend.
And leverage power and politics. What was triggered within me listening to you with Dr. Gary and also now is power and politics are often perceived as bad, negative influences, and leveraging power and politics. Isn't that like evil, manipulative, asshole management styles? Obviously it's not. And that's why I'm asking the question. So can you shed some light on a different way of looking at power?
Yeah. So that is definitely what you've just described, is the perception. As soon as we say power, as soon as we say politics, all of these negative connotations come to light. But if we kind of reframe or even look at beyond kind of the popular press, and we look at just the simple definition, pull open the Merriam or the Oxford Dictionary, and these are simply two forces that exist, okay, that are out there and are very much a part of organizational life. It's like they're invisible. It's like the air we breathe. And they're very prevalent, and so you need to understand them. And if you simply think of them more neutrally as forces, as things that are there, you can think about them as ways, because they are very effective forces at making things happen, for good or bad. We can get into that. And if you think of them that way, then suddenly you have this kind of liberation of kind of using these very highly effective forces in ways that can serve you, serve others, serve your causes, or serve your organization. And just to give a very simple analogy, because I think sometimes we get into definitions and so forth, but just think about power, for example, as fire. And if you think about fire, it can be something you take and you go pillage and you go burn stuff down. It can destroy. At the same time, fire we know is a force, and that can power a whole city, that can feed a whole village. You can do a lot of great things with it too. So thinking about power as a force and politics as kind of the air you breathe and the way things get decided, suddenly, shifts from this very negative mindset to a more, how could I use that to help me?
It's also to be aware of it. at the end of the book, towards the end, there's a thing about and I loved it. It really made me think that powerlessness corrupts, because we've often said, that power corrupts and ultimate power corrupts ultimately, or to something like that. Is harnessing power in politics, couldn't that be kind of a superpower that could be too strong? How do you balance that good and bad dimension that you mentioned earlier?
Well, the good and bad, I think, is something personal that people need to ask, right? We have, different kind of ways that we view ethics. We're both, global, and people come at this from different perspectives. So I think at the end of the day, each person has to kind of decide, or organizations decide, what is ethical or what are the bounds. But this idea again of power, and it is a way to make things happen. When you're in an organization, you have conflict, you are interdependent, you're dependent on other people, there's scarcity of resources. So there's mechanisms by which things get resolved. I mean, politics is simply that mechanism by which they get resolved. And if you think about power as, a way to help you take an initiative forward, we need to get more things done. Mm-hmm. Not a lot is getting done in organizations. So, there's the saying is, a lot of people give away their power by thinking they don't have any. And, this is flipping it around, and to say, instead of thinking about power, because we see so many negative examples of this, right? Of dictators, of really terrible CEOs or leaders who abuse power for their own personal ends. But if you can think about how you might use this in positive ways, it's a very, sorry to use the word, kind of empowering force. And if you kind of abdicate, this is actually more than people abusing it, the more of the thing you see, and studies have shown this, that people, as they rise, they kind of abdicate their power. They almost sometimes want to be too inclusive. They want to make everyone happy. And so they won't make decisions, right? Or there'll be analysis paralysis. And so abdicating your power, that's actually not serving your causes, your organization, or, for example, the people under you who want to grow and get things done.
That is in my experience, a really hard thing to balance. And that's something in the organization that I work with now, that it's which is basically formed through many different acquisitions. That how do you balance designing the company that we want to be together while still being inclusive and accepting, respecting the origins, the visions, the values of the amazing people that have come on board. And then there's also the question of, okay, well, when does some of those tensions cross that line of not being acceptable, and what do you do about it? So and this is really all about power as well, meaning it's the momentum and force of a large organization moving forward, with the momentum and force, because we all have momentum and force. We're in our career, we're doing our thing. Mm-hmm. And how do you do that together? So, Michael, how did this become a thing in your life? Because your background, I think you still even teach sometimes at Stanford, and you have experience in Europe and China and in the US. Now you're an executive coach. Why is this an important mission for you?
So it's, like we say, like most things kind of start personally. And, if I look back, and I share this in the book, but at the very beginning of why I have focused on this area, I saw a lot of great people not get ahead. I saw a lot of great people get, to use this analogy, they weren't in the game making an impact. They weren't even the coaches on the sideline making the impact. They were on the bench, or they were relegated somewhere else. Smart, hardworking, self-effacing, humble, all these things we want to see in our leaders. And then the ones who were getting the limelight weren't necessarily, we can attribute lots of things to those people, but a lot of narcissists, a lot of people who were doing backstabbing and other things. And so it was very personal saying, I mean, it made me angry. I think it makes most people angry. And I mean, one of the things about coaching is, hey, could you flip that around and be curious about it for a minute? Because as soon as we're in that anxious brain, we can't think straight. And it did make me curious because I went and I read a lot of the evidence, and the evidence would actually show why, because political skills and understanding power is what you need as you get to upper echelons. You're working through other people. And you know, big organizations, you have to have levers of influence. And so I was thinking, how can we help some of these people who got derailed, who came to me, and that's, you know, very painful when that happens, or they weren't being fulfilled or feeling like they were making an impact. How can we help those people maybe learn some of those skills that have these negative associations, which I don't think necessarily have to be negative, but not necessarily become those people they despise, or maybe have, in a lot of cases, have dubious ethics. So I dedicated myself to focusing on that area, helping people. And ultimately, that also helps organizations. You know, to your point before, we could go deeper into this. I mean, diversity, equity, inclusion, a lot of the things we see with existing societal problems, you really can't address those things unless you really understand power dynamics. So helping people understand on one level, right? So you can see what's going around, the power plays or things that are going on around you is one level. But then it's another to say, how might I want to engage or harness that in ways that could be helpful or in line with my values or ethics? And that's where I think the book really comes in, because that can be tough, right? We've grown up with certain scripts or ways that we're brought up. The leadership literature tells us a lot of things, which I would challenge, but helping those people has been really my core mission. That's how I came into this area.
Yeah. What's resonating with me when you say it, and the equity and equality and inclusion came up is oftentimes these biases happen if we're just operating by default. And if you are being more conscious and designing perhaps your career or your team or your organization, then you can be more aware of these things. And I agree with you. If you're in an anxious, stressed, fearful mind, then if you're a bit busy with your basic survival, then you're probably not worried about inclusion so much. Nor are you probably aware of designing your own career path and the power forward. I'm just curious, what would be a perfect client for you? Meaning, like, where is that person in the organization, and what is the question that they come and what are the outcomes that someone would be able to expect?
Yeah. So the clients that I think benefit the most are those who have gone from beyond individual contributor. They're at that kind of manager or emerging leader role. So that's middle, senior, let's call that senior manager, director, VP. And, they're, again, these talented attributes that we think of, they really want to make a difference. But they have those things like, I have been passed over a couple times, or my initiatives aren't getting through. And some of this stuff, this new person came in, or this person I dislike was able to really get their initiatives to go through. So those people, it's kind of like they're frustrated. That's for themselves, and the organization's missing out. So that's, and they would say, I feel like I'm missing something, right? Or they're moving into a level and they say, this is a different arena I'm playing in. And I know I need to do something different, but I can't quite pinpoint what that is. So that's really the sweet spot of people I work with and who benefit from it, because it is getting them to think differently about these things that they reject. Mm-hmm. Oh, politics means that you're not doing your job, right? Or power is, evil. And I shouldn't kind of lean into some of those things to make things happen. And when we work together, usually there's a part like they've been frustrated they haven't been promoted. And I would call that kind of a main issue that triggers people. They get frustrated about that. But deeper, really, when you unpack that and when we start working together, it's, people aren't feeling valued, right? This is essentially why people leave organizations, et cetera. It's not always about money and other things like that. So when we work together, sometimes it is about propelling their career path so they make more impact, or it's them helping them use these forces or thinking differently about them to how they interact and how they get things done. Or ultimately even deciding, this isn't the place I'm going to be able to make the impact. I shouldn't be so frustrated. I should also build my own power and leverage and find a place or build something on my own that's going to more embody my values or be the kind of place that does the things that I want.
Yeah, those are excellent reflective questions. Because either you accept the situation, you change the situation, or you exit the situation. Of course, there's all different variances and all that. As you go into higher levels of organizations, power and politics are really just part of the fabric of people working together. So, would you agree, or would you state that actually managing power and politics is really core to the job of an executive?
Short answer is yes. Yeah. I think it's a critical skill that we haven't, career skill that we haven't called out, navigating power. We talk about all these other things, right? Agility, knowing yourself, emotional intelligence. And certainly those are parts that feed into this, but there is that power dynamic, right? Someone else controls resources, or they see very differently than you. How are you going to, and you don't always get to choose those people that you work with. And you may be just set in structurally because of the way things are designed, right? Marketing and sales often fight because of the way things are set up, or their incentives are misaligned. And so, you need to kind of recognize that. And I would say, we need to get more things done, less, divisiveness, but finding ways to make things happen.
And one of the tactics for that is outlined in the book. Again, the book is Get Promoted, and there's 3 main sections: the rock, the map, and the snowball. So what we're about to talk about is a little out of context. So I would suggest people get the book. And you can download a couple chapters at Michael's website, which is Chang Wenderoth.
Chang
Wenderoth.
So my middle name is Chang.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, this is actually, it's good to point this out because I'm half Chinese. And so Chang is my middle name. And so people see that as change. So I always have to say, it's not change, it's Chang.
ChangWenderoth.com. And there's all sorts of links on the show notes as well. So if you're wherever you're listening to this, just follow it straight through. And what I'm really love to talk about, and this was the question that I had after listening to your conversation with Dr. Gary, is what is the power map? Like, can you describe that? And how would you make such a map, and what is the value of it?
Yeah. So that 3-part framework of which the book is laid out is the rock, the map, and the snowball. So those 3 pieces, and the map, that center part, is about getting strategic. So to talk about kind of what the power map is and why it's useful is, I encourage everyone to think about how they spent their last week, right? How are you spending your time in the organization? And, presumably everyone has some mandate or things that they're trying to get done. And when you really analyze that, if we could talk about 80-20 rule, lots of frameworks to think about this, is you really want to be spending all your time on things that can move the needle. And probably, and this is what makes a lot of people effective, is figuring out what you shouldn't be spending your time on, right? That has little return. The power map, and we can talk about the genesis of it and so forth, but is really a tool to get people to look at their organization in terms of where power influence lies and where you need to be engaging, in conversation with or influencing, so that you can better move the needle. And so the power map is different than an org chart, right? An org chart may look really pretty and tell you certain things, but it doesn't always tell you exactly where, power sits. And so this is a different lens by which you look at your organization, and you understand, okay, it's different also than a stakeholder map, but where power lies, because this is organizations or people, what those people care about, what their agendas are, who they're influenced by. And that then, if you kind of have the org chart, and if you were to overlay the power map, it might look very different. And depending on what you're trying to do, this is a very versatile tool. So it may be about getting promoted, making a lateral move, or get this change initiative through. It gets you to think about, where do you need to spend your time? This point about how do you become more strategic and intentional? We can talk about tactical things you would do. But first, you want to kind of so-called see the lay of the land. You have your goal, but if you want to kind of chart things out, that to get to point A to point B, you want to be saying, are there things that are going to help me accelerate that path? Are there barriers in the way? And how do I best navigate that? Because to go back to this point, a lot of people are actually spending their time maybe down in their team on things that frankly aren't moving the needle as much. And this helps you get that focus.
Two phrases you put in there, and I want to just call it out because in my observation, many people aren't busy being consciously aware of these things. But you said, okay, what is that person interested in, and who is that person influenced by? Because what I oftentimes see people looking up the org chart, and they're like, okay, well, that's the CFO, and therefore the CFO is the numbers person and will be very, structural brained, etc. And I think those preconceived notions can really blind people, because, well, what is that person actually interested in? Maybe that person is truly driven by some sort of sustainability issue and has a completely different set of passions that, maybe the person's work title have this, and maybe that person's influenced, because, when he or she sits in the cantina and for some reason, has lunch with the facilities staff, and that's where the person gets, their connection and their nourishment and stuff. And I think a lot of these things we don't see. So how would you recommend that people become aware of these dynamics in order to even, make such a map?
Yeah. And I think this is a really good point, because we will make assumptions, right? And to use that old saying, right? If you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. And so a lot of this is I get people to think about, again, this curious mindset. Think of yourself as an anthropologist. Think of yourself maybe sometimes as a detective. And because again, I go back to this central point, don't want to hammer on it too much, but organizations are people. And people make decisions, all of these well-known biases by which they make decisions, right? We like people who are similar to us, who fuel our agendas, et cetera. So you can start with certain things about human behavior, but there's the part around, if you assume, like in your example, the finance person just cares about numbers, maybe they don't. And there's some business concerns, like how is that person's incentive set up? But there's a huge part of kind of the ego, like what else motivates that person. And I think as you go further up, these things almost play even bigger into what happens to people. And so a very simple exercise, we can talk about multiple ones, and there are some in the book to think about this. But one of them is, I'll give you, two. One is to get in conversations with those people, not just in kind of the meeting where it's hard to have that. We underestimate the need to just have meals, conversations with people, to know them outside of work setting. I used to kind of crap on these kind of offsites or, ice-breaking activities, but they do serve a purpose because they get to start to connect on a human level. And people want to have that connection and actually can smooth over a lot of things, that may come up in the future. So to have those conversations, just be interested. What do you do for fun? I mean, there's that level, but there's also like, hey, what keeps you up at night in your job? They're in a very different function. Or if you could wave the magic wand, what would be one thing that would just double our, business? And so having those conversations, being interested, is one thing. The second, to this point about being an anthropologist, and I spent a long time in design thinking, and innovation. And the core there is that people will say one thing and they will do another. And so it's really useful to observe people. We used to do a lot of fly on the wall observation from people brushing their teeth, right? When I was doing work in dental, to interactions between doctors and patients, to even how meetings unfold. And here's what you can do is, be a fly on the wall. I mean, not literally, right? If you're in a meeting, but watch who's paying attention when someone else talks. Who is maybe nodding at someone else, or often the decision was already made before the meeting, right? And so can you tell who's deferring to who? And this applies across cultures. You really need this in certain settings, right? Where maybe the decision maker is kind of in the background, but then the last person wants to double check, they will go to that person who was silent all meeting and say, is that right? The clear action. And so you can get a sense then of what the power structure looks like, or who's influencing who. And that can serve you extremely well. And there's precedent for this, right? One of the most effective in what we would call political presidents, I'm going to use a US example here, Lyndon Johnson. He was the master of the Senate, as he rose. And I mean, I think everyone should read the book, kind of his biography. But he actually had his aides go analyze those meetings and other senators. And so and I've seen sales reps, we can talk about how this applies to sales, really understand what made individuals tick. So if you think about this in government, right, in a Senate setting, he knew how to bring votes together. He knew how to horse trade because he knew the things that mattered to people, either because it was in their interests or because something applied to their ego or their identity. And literally he would create these, and I think, probably in some places too, you can see this like dossiers on people. And you can see this played out in House of Cards, if you like, popular culture. He goes to the file on all these individuals. But that's something, and I'm saying you have to create a file on every individual, but to be aware. And I want to come back to your point on that.
So Michael, what is the power map then? Is that the file, or is that a physical sort of topographical map, or is there an outcome, or is this more of a conscious, mental exercise?
Yeah, so it is a actual piece of paper, to one thing, because organizations are complex, and I find it helps most of the executives I've worked with when they put it on paper and not trying to do it in a PowerPoint or Excel. Take out a piece of paper and a pen, the other way around, and to actually start with this and say, well, who's the person I believe is the stakeholder or key decision maker on this? What's about some things about their background? Like, how did they come up? What is their identity probably linked to? You may make some kind of assumptions or guesses at the beginning, but you want to kind of validate, triangulate through observation, conversations. What do they matter about from a business perspective? What do they care about an ego perspective, right? And then who influences them? And you kind of build it out that way. And notice you're kind of starting with probably the most powerful person. And you're not, frankly, it's generally not on the bottom of an organization. But this can be helpful in lots of ways, right? So if you're saying, who is the person who promotes me, right? Who are the ones who will have sway in the room when the vote is made or the decision is made around succession planning, et cetera? Or it could be, let's look at initiatives. Who's going to be the one, if they got behind this, they would accelerate it? Who's likely to block it? And so this is really, really essential. And we can talk about the genesis of why I believe this is really important and effective from having done a lot of work as a sales trainer and particularly selling into B2B environments. But you've really got to think about how you focus and spend your time. And this helps kind of lay out that landscape of where things are going to be to move the needle or minefields you need to be aware of.
No, it's funny you mentioned sort of enterprise or B2B sales, because that was also on my mind. I was like, hey, this sounds like, some sort of account plan, meaning, okay, where are you trying to go with the account? Who's the actual decision-making unit, the DMU, as we sometimes call them, and who are the influencers and blockers, and who are the, I think it makes a lot of sense. I'm pulling out from the book as well. I think it really has to be, maybe this is what The Rock is about, knowing what you want. Where are you going? What is the actual mission you're on? Is it like to get an initiative moving forward, to get your career to the next step, or something like that? So Is that sort of how, and how someone would do this? Just have a strong intent, do the power map, and get things moving, and then maybe call you for some support?
Yeah. So, the rock, I think, has two dimensions to it. I'm glad you called that out, because that's, we went right into this map, the middle section of the process. But the rock too is, what do you want? When you ask a lot of people, they actually can't tell you. You're like, oh, I want to be positioned for this. And so it forces them, and I'll just silence. What do you want? What do you want to achieve? And this is a really important question to ask people and for people to name. I think people sometimes feel reluctant of, oh, it's bad to be like, want to get to the C-suite, or it's bad to want to really get this initiative through because it's going to change the dynamic organization. Call it out, because then it helps you be very intentional about the things that you will do to help achieve that. And in fact, you kind of pull it back out. And we do this on a coaching basis. Are we moving the needle in that regard? Or do we need to reset the goal, because all the things you're doing would not indicate that you're trying to advance this? Is it something else? And that's not to say your goals can't change, but naming it. So that's one part of the rock. And then the second part of the rock is this deeper part around, let's pay attention to social science, because there's a lot of like, I'll give you advice on this. Leaders will say, do this. It's not what they actually do. If there's good research out there, I think it behooves us to look at it. And the research would say, right, your political skills is the number one thing that propels you upward in the ranks. Certainly when you move beyond individual contributor. That's one example.
No, so I think being very intentional and clear on where you're going and what you want. And what I also find is sometimes when people aren't clear with what they want, they can also be then very aware and almost fixated on all the reasons why it won't happen, sort of into victim mode. And I think the more intentional you are about, for the positive, right reasons, of course, where you want to go, then there's this shift of people start looking and seeking or being aware of enablers and supportive factors like that. So, Michael, thank you so much. This was the conversation of part 2 of Dr. Gary's episode. So again, I would really urge people to go on Apple Podcasts or wherever Spotify, wherever, and listen to that March episode with yourself and Dr. Gary, because they get, I think, a little bit more into your background and where you come from, and a bit of a wider. And then what I was really hungry for was this deeper dive. So thank you so much. I would really recommend people go to changwenderoth.com, and there you can download a first couple chapters of the book, or just go ahead and, wherever, and get promoted. What you're really missing at work that's holding you back. So, Michael, thank you so much. Is there any final message for people who are looking to take that next step in their career that you'd like to close with?
First, so thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I would tie in things that we both do, right? Which is simplicity and being able to focus on the things that move the needle. This is the big challenge for people, because there's so much going on. Organizations are, understaffed and people are overworked. There's so many distractions now, shiny objects out there. So it's really getting to, whether that's in your business or things that are going to move the needle in your career, or things that matter to you, is how to help pinpoint. And whether that's kind of the simplicity and the exercises you talk about, or using some of these tools of the rock, what actually does matter, and the map of where should I be focused. I think that's the number one thing that's going to help people and where they should get started.
Yeah, let me take a couple minutes on that, because like with the simplicity scan that I use in my work, it's coming at a different angle on some of these things, where it's typically designed for a management team, an executive team, or some sort of group of people that can influence the organization. And through a series of exercises or simplicity sprints to discover really where they're, what I like to call, in violent agreement or violent disagreement. Because this is where you can discover some of these things where power might be working against the organization. And if people are in complete agreement, I always like to ask why. mean, what is the preconceived notion or the assumption we're making there? Like, is this a trap that we're falling into? Or if they're all in disagreement, then you're like, well, why? Because assuming all these people are professionals and solid in their job, and they will have a rational reason for this. Well, engage in that dialogue. And then oftentimes there's things behind the scenes, what they're interested in, what they're influenced. So I can see a nice merge of those things. So great. Michael, thank you so much. And again, last plug for you, changwenderoth.com, and of course, wherever you get your book. And I believe it's in soft copy book as well, ebook, Get Promoted. So thank you so much. This has been delightful.
Absolute pleasure, Chris. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for listening. Download the Simplicity Toolkit from Ebullient.com to discover the power of the Simplicity Scan and Sprint. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite player.